Hello, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Storytime Clinic, where children's books and health collide. Well, normally on this podcast, every week I discuss a children's book that features a character with a health condition, but this week we're doing something a little bit differently. So once a month, I'm going to have on guests from all different walks of life who can give us a different perspective on child health. And today, for my first interview, I am very excited to welcome Miss Jamila Best. Woo! Yay! Ladies and gentlemen, we go way, 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 way back to high school.
Like chiropractic.
Way back. Okay, so Miss Jamila Best is currently a project manager at Power School, but she is also a special educator, and she has spent 10 years serving students of diverse populations from New York to Alabama. Thank you for joining us today, Jamila.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. How are you doing today?
I'm just chilling.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Sitting here in the midst of a pandemic.
Well, thank you for spending your time virtually with us today.
Of course. Where else would I be?
Fabulous. Okay, so tell us about how you got started in special education, why you chose this career path.
Yeah, so setting the scene, it's about 2009, and we're in the middle of a recession. And I have high hopes of wanting to go to school to either further my education and becoming a psychologist or, going into teaching. And at the time, I said, hey, I really want to make money. I want to go into, the teaching fields more so because I started to feel my passion while researching and through psychology and doing my thesis in college. My passion started to change into wanting to look more into students with mental health disparities and how that impacted their livelihood and outcomes, especially depending on their neighborhood. So whether or not they lived in urban neighborhoods or whether or not they were in affluent neighborhoods. And after doing that research, I really became passionate about wanting to go into the classroom because I said, hey, doing some good research here, spending some time here is really going to help me understand, why Black students specifically are being shunted into special education programs and how we can kind of eradicate that from being a thing.
Yes. Okay, all right. That sounds really interesting. And so you have worked in several different cities, right? I think you've moved around quite a bit. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so every environment has its own climate. I started teaching in DC, and in DC during that time, it was a political hotbed for education. So you had the chancellor, we were talking about different rules going on. This was when we switched to Common Core standards, which are now the way that we are starting learning, and that was something that didn't exist before. So now we're talking about we're holding all students to the same educational outcomes. How are we now tailoring special education programs to meet those needs? And so when I started out in teaching in DC, I started out in a resource classroom setting. And so a resource classroom setting allows students a more intimate opportunity to be able to work with a licensed special educator who's able to provide, services for that student within the either reading or writing or any other, part that they might need assistance with. I've specifically assisted with special education students in English. And so English is primarily where I supported students, or any other reading heavy class like social studies. And so in that setting, it was more so 5 or 6 students. We were all sitting around learning how to read. And I understood that even with working with my students, there were so many barriers. I started out with 7th graders, and my 7th graders were reading on a kindergarten level. I was like, wow, how did we get here? How did we get to the point in education where these students had been, passed over so many times that they had still stayed at their earliest foundational levels. And so you learn in talking to the students that there's a lot more that goes into special education than we think. And so when we start to talk about how do you even get qualified to be in special education,
Right. That is a wonderful question.
Yeah, there are 13 disabilities actually that would qualify someone to even be considered as a candidate for special education services at their school.
Okay.
And so within that, I worked with a lot of students whose disabilities ranged in multiple categories, but classified them as being emotionally disturbed at the time.
Okay.
And so, there were a lot of physical aggressions. There were a lot of things that were hindering their learning behaviorally from, benefiting from educational outcomes in the classroom. So because of their behavior, they were more than a year behind. And, those neuropsych evaluations, which are really key, we're highlighting, issues within the home or like fidgeting, can't stay still or attention issues. And this was happening for child after child after child. But I quickly found out when we removed them from certain environments, when you were able to have a more intimate setting with care, being paid to the students, with kindness and compassionate kids also, learning and benefiting in that environment, it really started to change their behaviors. And so I took that understanding with me to New York. And, oftentimes I recognize in New York that the spacing made it difficult for there to be such small settings. And so I advocated at my schools to, consider resource classrooms. Oftentimes the language around special education is inclusion. It is making sure that we can put students inside of the least restrictive environment. And that least restrictive environment is the environment with their peers. Let's consider in New York, this environment looks like 35 students in a classroom.
That's a regular classroom.
That would be a regular size classroom.
Okay. Okay.
And, with limited space, that might not be the least restrictive environment for a lot of our students who might have, sensory issues, who might have issues with, stimulation, who, are not necessarily paying attention inside of the environment because, there are other things that are going on internally inside of their mind. And so a lot of my work, I feel like, as I grew in New York, was about, okay, how do we get through what's going on inside of your head first so that you can even approach the game of learning. It's really difficult to learn, when certain needs aren't getting met, when you also recognize that your students might be hungry and they're coming to school without like proper nutrition, without like a coat on that morning, with concerns that might have happened inside of the household. And so being able to give students that safe space and that environment really helped flourish what I already knew was inside of them. It gave them the courage to be able to reduce their anxieties and their fears, to be able to embrace, that they didn't know how to learn something. And so I can learn how to do this. I can approach this. And so it really became a game of how do I build up their confidence in order for them to approach, being able to handle that this accommodation works for them, that this, method is going to work.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a very important perspective. Some children that end up in special education, of course, a lot of them have health conditions and things like that. But sometimes the behaviors that we are seeing that we may diagnose as part of a health condition like ADHD or something like that, as you're mentioning, the social situation really plays an important role in how that manifests in a child. So I think that that's really definitely an important perspective to have. Let's back up a little bit, because I think you have talked about some of the potential accommodations and things that a child can have as part of special education, which is the smaller classrooms and things like that. But when we think about special education as a whole, like what does that really mean? Like for someone who maybe has not been in this country, because actually not all countries have special education requirements, and in this country, in the US, this was not always a thing as well, you know. So you can talk a little bit about when special ed became a requirement. What is special
Yeah.
education? What do we mean when we talk about this whole system?
Special education was not always a thing in this country, and even our language has changed around it. The first time we started to see special education laws appear on the scene in the United States was in 1975. And in 1975, we had glad I wrote it down, Education for All Handicapped Children's Act. And so that act basically said, hey, students with disabilities belong inside of a classroom, they can learn. That's all it did.
Okay.
It was
Okay.
simply just a law that said, hey, everyone deserves the right to learn. It wasn't
Okay.
until around 1994, 97 when we started to come up with the concept of the, excuse me, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And
Okay.
so with that Disabilities Act, what we had was, a right to say students not only, deserve to be inside this classroom, they deserve to have a free and appropriate public education. It was the first time we're pushing back on the public institution to be the provider
Okay.
for student services in this manner to be able to develop a plan. And we improved this act in 2004, and we improved the act specifically because of the prevalence of African Americans, appearing in special education services, consistently being misdiagnosed, and also, with biases within testing. So when we started to talk about the law changing in 2004, we started to see it increase in equity, regardless of the fact that you had a disability. But we're also looking to make sure that every child, regardless of what they're bringing to the table and how they look, and what they're presenting, is going to be able to receive an equitable education at their level.
Hmm. Very interesting. You talk a little bit about racial biases in the special education system, which it sounds like things have gotten a bit better now. But what was happening at the time that was causing these children to be shunted into the special education system?
Yeah, the research would say that there are multiple factors, but more so there is a misdiagnosis that happens with students. So if we might be presenting a student who might be, fidgety, a little hyper, we're not necessarily considering age, we're not considering developmental, you know, process in life. We might approach that student and say, hey, this student has ADHD. And it's like, maybe not. Maybe the student is just, a little overactive. Maybe they just need a bit of an accommodation, like a separate seating location someplace else. Maybe they just need
Okay.
a few less distractions,
Okay.
But what we would see when we cross that line racially is we start to see, okay, maybe there's a teacher who sees a student, but is unaware of, culturally how that student might react, and,
I
is
see.
unaware of, what that student might be, going through, or has their own biases, and they might neglect that student for a year.
I
That might be
see.
the student that they send out of the classroom. And as a result of maybe being sent out of the classroom or being suspended for certain things, that student is now missing out on their education. Now all of a sudden they're eligible for services because they are a year behind. And their behaviors have increased in order, probably maybe out of attention seeking habits, but we also see this is now a diagnosis. And so
Right.
now we have, students who, if we're not inside of the appropriate environment, if we are inside of an urban community, who just might be collectively going into a place. Usually when we saw the 90s, we would see that special education classroom, we would see that placement, And that's what I feel like it moved away from in 2004. It moved away from
Okay.
being a place, and we started to talk more about the services that you receive. And so as we started to move away from that, you started to see the stigma disappear, but it's really hard to kill a stigma. It just stays on as a label with the student.
I see. I see. So it sounds like from what you're describing, teachers can play a role into whether a student with a disability or a health condition or a behavioral issue ends up in special education. What are the other ways that someone can end up in special education? Is it just teachers, or are there other people that can refer a student with a concern that they might need extra help?
Yeah. So I love that you said, a student might need extra help. The special education process was designed so that we're able to weed out students who just need a little extra help so that they're able to receive that help. And we're actually servicing students whose needs, whose disabilities would hinder them and make them a year and a half behind in their education. That's what makes a student eligible for special education services. Is their disability severe enough that it's put them at least a year and a half behind in their educational
So that
status?
year and a half number, is that kind of a specific measure?
Yeah, so it would be measured by, how does the state do their standards? What are
Got it.
those, what are the benchmarks for each grade that you're
Okay.
passing through? And if
Okay.
you're not necessarily at that benchmark, maybe you're in third grade, but you're reading at a first grade level, or,
Right.
that is definitely something that we want to catch. That's definitely a student that we might start monitoring, it might start observing and seeing if that student might be eligible for services. But nothing really gets started without the consent of the parent. And so
Okay.
that's the
Yeah, so
most
talk about
important
that.
part.
Talk about bringing the parents into the situation. How do you approach that topic with a parent? Are there meetings that they have to go to? How do they get engaged in that process?
Yeah. So the first approach would definitely be, sitting down with the parent and saying, hey, there have been some things that I've been observing inside of the classroom. I've been tracking these behaviors. In special education, if we were starting the formal process, it would be for 60 days. So, we've been tracking these said behaviors, and I wanted to talk to you. I think, it's really difficult, and it's, hard language to approach. But it's like, hey, there might be something that's going on. I go for evidence. I go for showing a parent, here are some things that I've noticed happening on the work assignment. Here are some things I noticed in class. And when I noticed this happening in class, I noticed the student doing this. A lot of being a special educator and being trained in being a special educator is being trained in being an observer. And so you're oftentimes watching the behaviors of the children to see exactly how that disability is manifesting inside of the classroom. So, I think oftentimes about math. That might be the easiest one sometimes to identify when I think about a student who has dyslexia. And
Okay.
in a student who has dyslexia, you might start noticing the math equations being a little off, or the numbers not necessarily matching up, or there being an upside down representation of the numbers. So you might have a conversation with the student out loud just to inquire, hey, I saw this happening, did you notice this? And that's the conversation that I bring to the parent, because that's the evidence. I don't like to approach it necessarily at, this is what your kid did in class today and this is what made me frustrated, but it's like, hey, with the wondering, this happened. Oftentimes, I'm able to assess and ascertain, like with the conversation of a parent. Sometimes a parent has been to me and they've been like, oh, wow, I used to do that as a kid too. And I had difficulties when I was a kid doing
Right,
that. And I'm
right.
like, oh, I
Yes.
think, I'm going to try. And I usually try approaching the parent with a couple of solutions. These
Okay.
are early conversations that I'm noticing in like the first 2 months, after sitting down with students, after doing enough, like, written work out. I'm looking at the work and I'm saying, hey, this is what I'm noticing going on. If that pattern persists for the rest of the time, then I am approaching that conversation with the parent as, hey, we're going to be eligible for services. At that point, the parent can say, you know what? I'm ready. Let's do it. evaluation process ideally starts then. The
Okay.
evaluation process starts with the parent taking their child to obtain a neuropsych evaluation. And so a neuropsychological evaluation basically assesses the not only the social emotional history of the student, but just their present levels of functioning. So how are they, doing, socially, environmentally? How are they performing within the testing environment? How are they responding to the questions that are being asked? Most of the time, the questions that are being asked are really assessing basic skills. They're assessing patterning representations within students, and everything is given a level. And so, as the special educator, I take those tests. I evaluate what those tests mean, what those levels mean. I say, hey, this is where this student is performing. Now we're going to make some observations happen inside of the classroom. Those observations happening inside the classroom are often about 60 days in the process.
And this
Those
is a
60
more
days.
formal observation than the previous 60 days.
Oh, this is the 60 days
Okay.
of
Okay.
that performance.
Gotcha.
You always want to have the evidence. So basically, what happens is you can't say that you didn't try everything. You cannot be a special educator and sign a student up for services at first sight of a disability.
Okay.
No,
Okay.
no.
Okay.
That is often a long, drawn out process because you want to say, I've done everything that I could, and I still was not able to reach that point with the student. And so you have to have that evidence in order to advocate sometimes for those higher accommodations.
Okay.
For example, if my student has dysgraphia,
And what is dysgraphia for my audience?
yes. So dysgraphia is a neurological disorder that basically impairs a student's written ability to, not only write but comprehend the language that they're seeing back.
Okay.
And so when we talk about a student having dysgraphia, sometimes we might be talking about overstimulation on the page. Maybe there's so much happening on the page that the student can't make sense of where everything is going. So we might even limit, their visual spacing on that page to only being able to see or only being able to write on just one section. So
Okay.
when I think about a student with dysgraphia in like the 7th grade, that student might have a notebook paper. Let's just hold this notebook up for example. But
Okay.
their notebook lines might actually be a lot wider spaced
Okay.
in order to accommodate, the sizing of their words because they need a little bit more space to make sense. We might make their words a lot bigger on the page as well. Those might be some basic level starters of accommodations that might happen. But because it has to happen for a lot of their material, that's where the dedicated person comes in to be able to,
I
make
see.
those accommodations
For
for the student.
Wow, that's really interesting. When you are recommending specific services for a student, talk about the IEP and an IEP meeting because this is a term that I've heard a lot. So what is an IEP? What does that mean?
I am so curious also as to how you hear about it in your field, especially in how that comes up. I am more than certain that parents are probably always asking you for information so that they can make sure it's included on the IEP.
Well, I will speak to that a bit. So as pediatricians, for certain kinds of diagnoses or as a child is being evaluated for special education, sometimes they might need a particular diagnosis that may come from the physician or from the neurologist or somebody else. So sometimes we're part of providing a parent or providing the school with the diagnoses that are able to support them getting additional help in the school setting. So we hear part of these things that happen, but we're not in the school system, and so sometimes it's a little bit hard to keep track of all the different
Oh, you mean we're like
parts.
a cross-functional team that
We
never
are a team. We are a multidisciplinary team for the child.
Oh, don't you love the MDT?
That is correct.
Okay, so when I think about what you're saying too with that diagnoses aspect and making sure that students have that diagnoses, and I'm thinking about the IEP meeting. we already have that information. So the process that I was talking about earlier, with, coming up with the observations, coming up with the neuropsych evaluation, all of those things determine what a student's disability is. And so after we have that student's disability that we have on the IEP, we can now start to proclaim a meeting. At that meeting, you'll have the special education teacher, you'll have the general education teacher, you'll have the parent. Sometimes, depending on the age of the student, you'll have the student present at the meeting as well, because the student does serve as a very important advocate to themselves, especially at the transitionary years. I find that high school is a time that students really need to be sitting down at the table. Coming right out of elementary school, students need to be sitting out at the table into middle school, and expressing their interests, expressing their fears, what they like and dislike. As soon as that student has vocal control and command and understands what's going on with them, they should be at their meeting.
Interesting.
And so when we approach that meeting, we're talking about what is that student's present levels of performance? What are their test scores looking like for the school year? What did their assignments look like in class? What was their performance like in reading? Usually the primary subjects are reading, writing, and math. So what was their work looking like in reading? What was their work looking like in writing? What was their work looking like in math? And the teacher is talking about that. The teacher will also sit and develop goals around what the student is accomplishing. And when I think about developing goals, goals are all about for 1 year. What is that student going to be able to do in order to bridge the gap between their knowledge and understanding and their present grade level? How are we getting the student closer to being at grade level? The idea is always to wean the student off. After we have these goals developed for the student, we'll also look at their social behaviors. We'll talk to what about their friends and how their relationships are like with their friends. What about how their relationships? Yeah, very much so. And you'll see sometimes too that a lot of different behaviors manifest themselves just based on social cues and environments, especially when we're talking about students who, I think about more so students who are impulsive in that way, who might have a tendency to, let's say, blurt things out with their classmates in the classroom. Like, I'm really excited to give an answer. Here's the answer. And I'm always appreciative of students' enthusiasm, but I think about what that moment causes sometimes on the playground when we're not looking. And, the students are together and they're able to then talk about each other. When I think about those stigmas again, that's kind of where that comes up. And some students have great working relationships with their peers. Some students are, maskers and, don't necessarily like to show the fact that there's something that they don't know. So they might even shun away and become quiet. These are all things that we're observing and tracking, and it's especially important over the year to be able to collect that data so that when we're talking about developing new goals and new plans for that next upcoming school year, the other teachers well aware, we're able to talk very definitively about what their progresses look like. Some other elements of an IEP that are really key in an IEP meeting as well is determining what are their related services. And so when we're talking about related services, a student who has any type of motor functioning disabilities might need an OT. And
OT here is occupational therapist, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So they might need like occupational therapist or maybe even a physical therapist, depending on.
And those services can be provided through the school?
Yes, they are supposed to be provided through the school. I'm so glad that you mentioned that. It is up to the school to be able to provide it. But when we start to talk about what does the least restrictive environment look like, there's a lot of gray room and area within that field. So sometimes if you're in a charter school, which I think is, the case with a lot of the students that I worked with in our environment, a charter school does not have like a school district, like a public school district does, these people who are on payroll. So you're oftentimes contracting out from the school district services into the school. which
Okay.
there might be delays on in terms of budget or other pieces. So in
I
an
see.
ideal environment, a student would have an occupational therapist if they needed one. They would have a physical therapist if they needed one. They would have a SETS provider, which is what we have in New York, which might be called something different in different states, which is a teacher that comes in specifically to teach that student reading, writing, or math in a
Okay.
small group format outside
Okay.
of the classroom.
Okay. I
And
see.
so those are what I would call like those top heavy related services, busing, transportation. And those are sometimes difficult services to achieve. If you're living in an urban environment and you're in a city, if you're in a private school, I even think about a private school is not required to provide these services.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Isn't it? Isn't it? And so when I think about what does that mean? What does that mean in education? Is a student recognized at a private school? Absolutely, as having a service. If a student wants accommodations, we will gladly make testing accommodations in private
Okay.
schools
Okay.
so that students have extended time. We'll also make any type of environmental changes that student might need inside of their environment. But outside of that, there's not really much of an availability of services. So I always encourage parents to truly think about what
Yeah.
placements, they're considering for their child,
Yeah.
especially determining their child, pertaining to their child's needs.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because a lot of times people have the perception that everything's going to be better at a private school, but if they're not required to have all the services available that could benefit a child with a disability, then the child may actually be at a bit of a disservice at a school like that versus at a public school.
Correct.
Interesting. So, one thing you talked about that I think is really important is that transition time. So you talked about children being available and present at their IEP meetings, and in case we didn't mention it before, IEP is an individualized education plan. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So, and the importance of having them present and participating at those meetings as early as middle school and then in high school as well. What happens when they're transitioning from high school to college? Do these services go along with them? Do they age out of the services? What happens there?
Yeah. So depending on you age out of services. That was one of the key things in the IDEIA, the Improvement Act of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. One of the things that they improved was making sure that the age out age was 21. So after you turn 21, you complete summer school the year of your 21st year, you're no longer eligible for special education services. As students go on to college, they are continued to be covered because we do have, an overall act, thanks to our civil rights. Thanks to our Civil Rights Act, we are covering students who have disabilities. And so, but we're covering them differently. So if you don't advocate for yourself when you get into college, the services are not necessarily something that's going to be available for you. So when you get to college, you have to say, hey, I had an IEP when I was growing up. Here's my disability. These are the accommodations that I need. And most times colleges will be willing to work with you through that ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act.
I see. Okay. All right. That's really good for them. Is it possible for parents to refuse their child having special education services? I know we've talked about the stigma that can be associated with that. Is it possible for a parent to refuse? Is it possible for a child to refuse since they're present and participating in their meeting?
It is not possible for a child to refuse. They are still considered minors, and their parents are indeed still in charge.
That's useful.
I just had to state it for the record. because there are certain things that while we do want to raise independent children, we also do want to recognize that sometimes our children might not know what's best for them.
They're not quite there yet.
Not quite there yet. So, they might have to be encouraged to embrace some of these support services that they are being given for their benefit. Now, parents can refuse special education services to their child, and I have seen that happen to children's advantage and disadvantage at the very same time. It really depends on an environment, I feel like. Environment is very key when we're talking about why a parent refuses. Is the parent refusing because of stigma? I've often found that a lot of my students who are students with special needs have parents with special needs. And so there's oftentimes been a stigma from when that parent, especially as we go through generations, right?
And they might have experienced how hard it was for them in that circumstance. I see.
And they don't want that same thing for their kid. And so, for those parents, you might try a different approach at helping them understand, what is the difference? How are they going to benefit? How is their child going to benefit from being able to have this service? Sometimes it's a convincing factor. Sometimes there is no convincing factor. A parent doesn't want to recognize that, their child has a disability. And I think that that's a difficult conversation to approach. It's really tough. It's tough sometimes, especially when you're supporting a student that you see really could benefit from the service, really could use the support. A great teacher is already giving certain levels of support to everyone inside of the classroom. And so you understand how much more they can be able to benefit, sometimes with that label. I think that, I say label because we're talking about a law. You're talking about a legally binding document that you can use, advocate, and say, hey, you're not following what you said you would do. You need to do this. And with
you're talking about the parent having that power to hold the school
towards the school district,
right,
towards the teachers inside of the classroom, and they have that right to command that their child is getting what they need. Oftentimes that depends on the level of involvement on the parent's side too. And it's crazy. In different regions, I see different things. So in DC, I saw a lot of parents have advocates inside of their IEP meetings in order to support, some of the accommodations that they really felt their child needed and were already difficult to obtain by the school district. So we're talking about, we're talking about that OT, right? So that occupational therapist to come inside of the school. We need that person. We're talking about that speech therapist, to be able to come inside of the school. And we need an advocate in order to get there. And that's something that's recognized in DC. Bring an advocate to the meeting, you're going to get your services.
And an advocate is someone who is more familiar with this whole system and kind of knows how to push. Because I presume that for parents who've never gone through this before, or, someone who doesn't have a child who needs any of these services, this whole system might be very confusing for them. So sitting in that meeting, they may not even know what's available and what they could ask for.
And the language to use, like what's happening, like, where do I go when I don't have this? And an advocate is a key role, usually as a pro bono lawyer, or, very much so involved or has been deeply steeped in special education in the country. Yeah. So when I think about those difference in regions, I see New York where parents are a little busier and don't necessarily have the time to be present at the meetings. Sometimes, we're having an IEP meeting on the phone with the parent and we're, listening, and the parent's like, hold on, I got to get up for work. There's a lot of different, lot of different, it's not every parent, so it's not to say, but when you start to look at trends of different regions based on, sheer, just where you live and how the communities operate, you see a lot less of that representation from advocates happening within, the school systems here. And you see a lot more of charter schools accommodating what does that service look like, or let's figure out another way we can make that small group happen within, our sector. So you might see a little bit more accommodation. It might be a little bit more rigid inside of, a public school setting, but you'll still get those related services that you might not get inside of a charter school if it's not necessarily something that was available in the budget or something that the district is willing to give, which is why I'm like, I wish New York had advocates, would have more of an advocate representation, because I do believe sometimes my lovely great state is skirting around, providing services for students with special needs.
So are the advocates, how does someone get an advocate for an IEP meeting? Is this like a volunteer organization? Is it something that parents can kind of reach out to people who've gone through the process before and they might have a connection for an advocate? Or is that something that the school will make sure it's available at a meeting?
The school will never make you got to see how it's a conflict of interest.
Understood.
So the school might never present you with an advocate. However, there are services and companies, like there's Advocates for Children in New York, ACNY, if you're here. And if you do a Google search of just different advocacy organizations, you'll see a bunch pop up, because this is a hotbed. We're talking about a child's right to education. If you're willing to pay, there are other services as well. I think about how complicated it gets when we know that a setting isn't right for a child. So like I said, in a free appropriate public education, the least restrictive environment is where we want the kid to be. We want the kid to be in a class with all their classmates, regardless of disabilities. The most restrictive environment for a student would be, having a teacher and probably about 3 other adults with them, in a setting. And that's the setting. That's restrictive. Removing them from a free and appropriate public education into a different setting is restrictive. And so when we start to talk about why we need to move a child from a least restrictive environment to a more restrictive environment, you're starting to talk about, well, we need more proof. We need more of this because it costs more of this.
But sometimes that's what the child might need for their level of disability, right?
Exactly. And that is still what the state is required to provide. At least in New York State. I know in some states it does vary. When I moved to Alabama, I was very surprised to see that, speech is the only service that private schools are required to provide for their students, speech and consultation services. So when I think about that, I'm like, oh, wow, that's interesting. I wouldn't want to put my student in a public, in a private education setting there, because I know that my child would be missing out on all, of the services that they would be required to receive. And so it's really key to just kind of think, like, if my student needs to go to a private education, if my student needs, a private education setting in a developmental or a therapeutic environment, that's going to take a little bit of work. I might want an advocate, somebody who's donating that time for free. I can always hire a lawyer, but I want an advocate who's going to be able to help me navigate those waters so that I'm able to get what I need for my kid.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jamila, thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. I think I can see how complicated this can all be. So really your message of being able to have an advocate, if possible, at your meeting, I think that's huge. That's what I would do, because I would definitely need help with these things. In my previous episodes, I looked at kids with all different kinds of conditions. So one with physical disabilities, one who's pretty severely intellectually disabled and has physical disabilities, to all the way to someone who had dyslexia and autism. So I think it's really interesting to have this conversation and see how each of them might require something different in terms of an accommodation at school. But really having people there, like special educators and other people who can advocate for them to get the right services that can really help them bring out the best that they are able to do. I think that's a huge and a very important role. So thank you so much for all that you do, and thank you so much for joining us today on the Storytime Clinic.
Dr. Umoren. I appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. And thank you to all my listeners for tuning in today. If you would like to have any more resources, we will put a few links on the podcast website at www.storytimeclinic.com. And so we will have a few more resources on there. Thank you very much.